Welcome back to View from Brussels. My name is Brandy Miller. Today in the studio, we're unpacking some of the key takeaways from the Munich Security Conference. And for that, I'm delighted to have Luka Ignac, who is Foreign Policy Analyst. Luka, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to jump in a little bit on your take of the Munich Security Conference, because you spent a lot of your career working at the intersection of EU policy as well as transatlantic security and AI and defense. So for that, I want to pose you a bit of a question of what are you thinking about what's the current state of the global order coming out of the Munich Security Conference?
Well, it's a big question, but I think it's an indicative one of where we are, right? If we have to question where we are heading, then it means there are some changes undergoing. I think this Munich Security Conference in particular has pointed out to a very different dynamic in the transatlantic relationship. We're no longer talking about a sort of Europe looking towards the U.S. and looking for ways in which we could work together in strengthening the rules-based order. But as the Munich Security Conference report said, we're seeing world under destruction, or the order under destruction to some extent. And it's interesting to see different messages coming from leaders across Europe, but also United States, sort of signaling to the fact that things are no longer the same as they were just a couple of years ago. I think Friedrich Merz, in his speech, pointed out the fact that the global rules-based order, we can no longer go back to where it was. But I also think it signals a momentum of opportunity and challenges that are ahead of us that we can benefit from. You mentioned also, AI and defense in particular in all of this. And I think that's the conference itself signaled a very interesting opening there. I think this connection between AI and defense is something that perhaps in this city we don't talk about as much. But I do think that uniquely that's a very similar ecosystem, and one that's increasingly starting to show these connections in the policy world as well. And so looking at not just MSC but beyond that, we can think about sort of what is the impact of the conversation about where Europe is heading and where the world is heading on how we conceptualize the defense tech ecosystem. And so for Europe, the answer has been, or recently, the answer has strongly been sovereignty and the questions about how do we become a little bit more autonomous. And I think that's something that specifically is going to affect these two domains and the interconnections between them quite a bit. And so I think there's a lot to unpack there, but I think hopefully that answers your question.
Yes. And on the question of European defense and the state of play, so would you see some of the pragmatic first steps of it evolving coming out of the Munich Security Conference? Do you think that leaders are paying attention to this new geopolitical reality and the fact that the transatlantic relationship is fundamentally changing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think everyone is clearly sort of continuously monitoring and seeing what is coming out of Washington and out of the current U.S. administration, how the changes in the rhetoric, but also in the policies that the U.S. is implementing are affecting not just European Union as such, but also the NATO and broader relationship as well. And I think what's emblematic of this is that Europe is clearly doing more to sort of build up its own capacity, to build up its own defense capacity, but also thinking about the ways in which it can strengthen itself in the tech sector, right? And so I think talking and thinking about European movements recently, I'm thinking about the defense omnibus that's underway, the European the rearm plan that's hoping to deliver 800 billion of euros in funding until 2030. These are all good steps that Europe is taking in order to really position itself as a stronger defense player. But the question always is and will remain, how fast and how effective are we able to implement these changes? And I think that's often the criticism we hear, that Europe oftentimes talks the talk but doesn't walk the walk. And so I think now we need to start thinking, okay, we have these plans, we have these ideas. These are good ideas and good plans, and we're starting to identify what the core problems are, which is really the production and the industrial capacity of Europe.
Yeah.
And so what now the focus really should be is thinking about, well, how do we go back as Europeans together and think about ways in which we can strengthen our industrial capacity? How can we deliver fast, and how can we deliver good and safe products? And so I think in this particular sphere, the conversation about defense and tech overlaps quite a lot.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we're going to see a lot of changes going forward, and where we're seeing also already a lot of European leaders paying quite a bit of attention to.
Yes, and your work has been on the intersection of AI in defense. So I do want to focus on that a bit more and your perspectives about Europe thriving in areas such as AI governance, particularly as the relationship with the global role of the US and the predominance of China in alternative models of governance are coming into play.
Absolutely. I think there's clearly a combination of factors there, right? US is becoming is sort of developing its own approach towards AI and governance, and it's seeing more, or it's hoping to see growth and sort of development of the sector through sort of market-driven models, allowing a little bit more, or quite a bit more flexibility than the Europe envisions that for its own market. China, on the other hand, is kind of keeping very strong control over its AI sector and trying to use state capacity in order to build up its AI industry. And I think here Europe has a real opportunity, right? I think we oftentimes are starting to see that there is this sort of clear dynamic and conversation about the global race and AI in that race and the great power competition and how it's going to impact that. But I also think that might be a little bit of a flawed way to think about this. And the reason why I'm saying this is because I don't think that the race to develop the best and the brightest AI is necessarily the only thing that matters. I think how AI implementation is going to go, how well the adaptation of AI models and AI systems is going to happen across the board. Who is going to build more data centers and have more data and compute capacity at the end of the day? What about the industrial capacity? Who is going to be able to produce, more devices or more weapons that are going to be able to use those models and use some of those systems? Who's going to be able to set standards? So I feel like there's a lot of different modes to this race that oftentimes get kind of packed under a single, who's going to get first past the post. And I think that might be a little bit of misleading conversation. And I think that's if we start sort of rethinking the idea of the race and the idea of this competition, then we can also identify a very clear role for Europe. Europe has been a very good standard setter in a lot of different fields. It's trying to, and it's asserting itself in the AI world as well, through the AI Act and digital omnibus and simplification efforts that are happening. EU is clearly trying to put its stamp in this game. However, in order to be an active player, of course, we need to start thinking about our industrial capacity and specifically our ability to also, if we are governing the models, if we're trying to be part of this conversation, we need to bring something to the table. And I think that applies equally in defense and in tech.
Yeah.
And it's something that I like particularly paying attention to because I think Mark Carney said it also in Davos, the Prime Minister of Canada. He said it, that either you're going to be at the table or you're going to be eaten. And so I think part of being at the table means you have to have the capacity to back up the values that you believe in. And I think Europe as a value-based experiment, as we often talk about European values, we often talk about how important they are for us. And that matters clearly to both European policymakers and voters and citizens. But fundamentally, I think in order to back up those values and in order to be able to actively not just write letters of condemnation or support of things, but to be taken seriously into consideration, we need to think about that industrial capacity that Europe needs to really rebuild.
So apart from the industrial capacity, I want to go back to this standard setting. So how do you see this playing out in practice, as well as do you think the EU can rely on other partners within the ecosystem to set global standards, particularly in AI governance?
Absolutely. I think EU has this, there's now a new narrative that we're often hearing in media, but also I think in policy conversations, where EU should be leading this coalition of middle powers in order to really kind of set this global framework for regulating AI across different dimensions. And I think that is a helpful framework, but I think EU should start thinking about itself more than just a middle power. I think we are a very big continent and a very big project that has a lot of capacity, policy capacity in particular, and also standard setting capacity. The Brussels effect, when it was coined, there's now also a debate whether it still matters and to what extent we can actually play into it. But I do still think that, when 27 member states come together with our partners, we can achieve that difference. And so I think when it comes to standard setting, specifically on AI, we need to start thinking about ways in which we can start looking a little bit less inward and start looking externally what's happening. How can the EU work with countries outside of our immediate
intra-EU, yeah.
Exactly. And how can we think about, what is China doing in the global south in terms of selling its models or access to its technology? How do we get EU standards and EU perspective on this to be more appealing to those countries? How do we work with even the United States, which right now seems to be sort of far out there in terms of disagreements on policy, specifically on AI? But there are states and there are local leaders who are really willing to have these conversations. We need to think beyond just election cycles. And I think that there are still voices that you can engage with constructively. And even in private sector, I oftentimes say, I think the US private sector is the one that European leaders, European companies, but broader European ecosystem can engage with pretty well in this conversation. And we've seen this with the code of practice. A lot of US companies have signed on to it. And so I'm trying to always kind of find an opportunity and a positive story behind all of it. And I do think there is one. I don't think everything is doom and gloom. And
well, I will ask a question about doom and gloom.
I'm always happy to answer. But I do think that fundamentally, it's more about recognizing that we do have a voice, we have a powerful one, and really tapping into the fact that when we are acting as a cohesive unit, we can actually have quite a bit of strategic power.
Yeah. So I do like the part that you bring a lot of the capabilities, the possibilities, the EU's role. So now I do want to turn to the vulnerabilities. And we saw that really playing out with Ukraine as well as Greenland. So do you think this is serving as enough of a wake-up call to the EU? And if so, what do you think is to expect out of the shifting dynamics of the EU-US relationship?
And that's a difficult question, right? I wish I could have an off-the-cuff answer that's, yes or no. Changing. Exactly. Yeah. But of course, it's a complicated story, right? We are now seeing 4 years since the Russian invasion of Ukraine has started. And it's a very difficult dynamic simply because, there's intra-EU dynamics that are complicating the sanction packages towards Russia, and that are also affecting our ability to aid Ukraine in its battle for sovereignty and independence, and to defend its territory from further Russian invasion. And that matters, right? And it clearly did struck a chord with the European leadership, but also the European public. However, as time passes, that's also kind of, the attention is fleeting, and that's dangerous. On the other hand, we can also look at the Greenland example, and I don't necessarily look at it as a negative example I think it's a pretty good example of European leadership working.
Okay.
When we are, and I think that's back to the point where I was saying cohesion is a strategic tool that we can leverage pretty well when we are very cohesive. And I think Greenland demonstrated that. We had a very strong response to what was coming from President Trump, and we've set very clear red lines. It seemed like U.S. was trying to push them as far as they could. We were talking about reciprocating in terms of trade, and imposing pretty severe costs on the U.S. economy. The U.S. markets reacted, and the world markets reacted pretty well to that. And that, I think, that was a very clear indication that we do still have power, and we can leverage that power when things are starting to look pretty serious. The question is, how often can we get to that cohesion? That's a whole different debate. But back to your original question, which is whether these two have kind of impacted the broader political leadership, right, and the sort of the U.S. European relationship. I think U.S. is reevaluating its relationship with Europe. I think it's, I would always say, repricing it. At this point, we can talk about that Europe is waking up to this fact, but I don't think fast enough. We had a long time. We had a previous Trump administration that was telling us very similar stories, albeit in a very different tone.
Yeah.
And with a much less of a sort of threat of costs on us. However, we have had some time to adapt to these political realities, and we just haven't done it in a way that was fast enough. And so um, I think for Europe, it really is thinking about ways in which we can build up our own power. And for me, the power really means, as I mentioned several times, it's building the industrial capacity to actually be able to put something behind the words that we're saying. It's building partnerships with those countries that do believe in the same values and interests that we share. And fundamentally, it's also being clear and cohesive in the ways that we want to approach certain things, and not kind of letting our internal divisions get the best of us. And those are three big ambitions, I think, for Europe to achieve. And specifically in the policy context, I think it's starting to show that we're not always fully there. We're not always moving at the speed that the battlefield is requiring us. I mean, in order to be able to provide Ukraine with the aid that's needed, we had to 80%, I think, of the aid that EU was giving to Ukraine was coming from non-European sources, and I think that demonstrates that we can talk about sovereignty, but we don't really have currently something to back it up in terms of real capabilities. And so I think for me, what this whole debate about the future, not just of the transatlantic relations, but of sort of our response to what's happening on the broader geopolitical scale is, I think we need to move beyond the conversation about whether we need strategic autonomy and strategic sovereignty, and a debate that's been going on for so long. I think we've all agreed now that it's needed, right? And so now I think it's moving really fast on what's needed in order to get there.
So on that, would you say, do you have any fears about the EU being reactive versus proactive and realizing the state of play or its role within the world and its relationship with the US?
I think we're starting to wake up to the fact that we need to be more proactive.
Okay.
I think EU has been really reactive when it comes to crises that have traditionally happened in the transatlantic relations, and primarily because I think we've always believed that that's a fundamental bond that cannot be really shifted. And I think even the sort of the reaction to the Secretary Rubio's speech in Munich indicated that, where there was a big applause following a message that was not fundamentally different to the one that Vice President Vance delivered last year about the civilizational erasure, the question about, your state of the European democracy. However, it was said in a very different way, and it appealed in a very different way, I think, because of its diplomatic tone, right? And so I think that there we can see that sort of hesitancy from our side to really grasp the problem at hand and make the necessary political choices. I personally think that, this situation requires some really bold leadership, and it's going to take some really difficult choices to be made, policy choices to be made, that are going to be also costly, I think, for whoever makes them.
So on translating perhaps intentions into capabilities, because that's also a key aspect that the EU is a regulatory power, but can it be an enforcer as well? Do you see Europe's AI and digital legislation supporting innovation in defense and security?
Yeah, so back to regulation, right? I think for me, when it comes to regulation, again, it's not an issue to regulate any of these fields. I think that's the ability of EU to regulate is one of its strengths, right? We've created the European institutions in order to create some sort of regulatory frameworks for so many different fields.
Yeah, the Brussels effect, as you were speaking of.
Exactly. And so now I think the question is, how do we use the regulation that we have and create an environment in which we can grow our own companies, our own not just venture capital, put our European money towards European defense and tech ecosystem. And I think for, savings and investment union is one example of that, how, we need to start thinking about ways in which we can actually move beyond just regulating and thinking about, okay, how do we create the capacity? How do we create the ability to, again, be at the table and bring real capabilities to the conversation? And in that way, you're not just strengthening Europe, but you're also creating a very different dynamic in the transatlantic relationship, where we're not just a dependent partner on the United States, but we are a more equal partner. And once you're a more equal partner, the conversation becomes also different. And I think then we're going to be able to also, and I think we're starting to see this now, then we can also have a little bit more frank conversation about foreign policy priorities. What type of engagements would Europe like to take part in or not? And I think that's something that we should definitely focus on more.
That makes sense. Well, we are getting close to the end, so I promise I'll keep it a little bit short and sweet. I do want to stick a little bit more on the EU champions that you're kind of speaking of and building up SMEs as well as Europe's industrial capacity. Do you see any reforms urgently needed in order to create this co-equal partnership between the EU and US on these capabilities?
I think on the European internal level, I mean, there's some great examples of champions. I mean, Helsing is a German company, a defense tech company that's I think now valued at 12 billion euros.
Mhm.
I mean, just a few years ago, we had no companies in this ecosystem, and now we're talking about few champions that are truly European. Um, However, I think there's always a question about joint procurement, and that's something where I think we're really behind. And in terms of specifically building our own defense and tech ecosystem in Europe, um, being willing to invest in joint capabilities that are not benefiting only one or two major member state markets is going to be critical. And I think the conversation about, what does the defense market and the tech market of the future look like is going to be, I think it's going to be a conversation that's going to need to cross some really difficult red wires, and primarily because, I think Germany and France are not gonna be the only ones who can benefit from any kind of defense or tech integration.
Mhm.
It has to be broadly felt across Europe. Smaller member states need to be able to have their say in the procurement priorities. I'm thinking in terms of particularly Baltics and the Nordic countries who see and feel the war much closer than maybe the other European
Yeah.
countries, and might have a little bit more of a sense of, well, what should be our what should be our capabilities that we are procuring. And so I think thinking through ways in which procurement can be not just done jointly, but also quickly is going to be critical. And also procuring European. I think, there's oftentimes that conversation about we're purchasing a lot of non-European goods, especially in defense, of course, in tech as well. I mean, chips we're just not there anywhere close to it in terms of what we need to produce in order to supply for our own market. And so I think thinking about ways in which we can still continue working with our traditional partner and allies while also investing money in our own production line is critical. And there are ways to do this. I think, there's still ways in which we can continue buying weapons that the U.S. is producing and the U.S. defense companies is producing in order to help aid Ukraine, while also investing some of our own money, of European savings money, into our own defense companies and our own defense ecosystem in order to build up our ability to call ourselves autonomous in any way, shape, or form.
Well, on that, I do have my final question, and do pardon my pun. So, if we do take a zoom out of what's happening in the collapse or supposed collapse of the rules-based order, do you believe that power politics are now trumping international law?
I think it's too early to tell.
Okay. Okay, what would be your prediction, perhaps, or a hope?
I think we're still a little bit too early to tell, and I think my hope is I'm going to end up on a hope.
On a hopeful note would be
Exactly.
nice.
I think it's important to always try and focus on that. I think my hope is that as Europeans, we wake up to this moment, and we'll wake up to the reality of the fact that the moment that we start investing in our own power strength capabilities, however we want to call it, it's the moment that we're going to be able to shape the world as we want to see it. And so we might not want to, we don't need to say goodbye to the rules-based order, but we need to be able to defend it with something at the table. And I think for me, I'm hoping to see that in the next MFF, in the next legislative cycle. I wanna see Europe that's willing to take some bold choices in order to really protect the rules-based order that has benefited us in so many ways.
Well, thank you, Luka, for being here today. And thank you to our viewers for joining. Make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.